Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Mike Lazaridis Theatre of Ideas here at Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And welcome to Perimeter's public lecture series presented by Sun Life Financial. My name is Greg Dick. I'm the Director of Educational Outreach here at Perimeter, and it is a sincere pleasure to welcome everyone here this evening. Both those of you here in the live studio audience and those of you watching online, either on Perimeter's website or on one of our many science communication colleagues' websites around the globe. Now, the lecture itself will last approximately 1 hour and will be followed by a question and answer session. But for those of you watching online, we have Dr. Damien Pope and Dr. Kelly Foyle and a team of PI researchers behind their keyboards in the chat zone ready to engage in conversation. And they'll be there not only during the lecture, but also for 30 minutes after the lecture if you want to engage in that conversation. Please use hashtag PI Live. And also, I'll be taking a question or two from the Twitter feed during the question and answer. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's very special guest speaker, Dr. Vilhelm Bohr. Dr. Bohr earned his degree in medicine at the University of Copenhagen, and later his PhD and his Doctor of Science at the same university. Since 1992, he's been the department chair at the NIH National Institute on Aging in Baltimore, Maryland. And Dr. Bohr's work in biomedical research focuses on genome stability and DNA repair, and how this changes with aging and premature aging diseases. In addition to his groundbreaking DNA research, as the grandson of Niels Bohr, he maintains the role of chair of the Niels Bohr Archive in Copenhagen. Tonight, he will provide truly unique perspectives into the insights and into his grandfather's life behind the well-known physics, including important influences that Niels Bohr's father, wife, and brother had on his life and on his career. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Vilhelm Bohr.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and I've had a wonderful day visiting this institute. I'm very impressed with the staff here and many of the things that I've seen. And I hope you'll invite me back someday to talk about aging, which is what I'm working on, but unfortunately that's not real hardcore physics yet. So this is a talk about Niels Bohr, but not about the physics, but about the life behind physics, and I hope that this audience will find it interesting because it will not contain any physics, really. So it's just about the background of his life and some personal perspectives on this. And the way that I have structured this talk is to talk about the people that influenced Niels Bohr and the people that were close to him. And this is very important in this case because Niels Bohr had many close relationships and relied very much on them throughout his life. And I'll talk about his father, Christian Bohr, here. I'll talk about his brother, Harald Bohr. I'll talk about his wife, Margrethe. That'll be a big part of my conversation. I'll talk about this woman here, Hannah Adler, who played a big role in his life. I'll talk about the whole family around Niels Bohr, and I'll talk a little about the physics at the Niels Bohr Institute, or the experience at the Niels Bohr Institute, and things that happened before and after the war. So I want to acknowledge some people at the start. My father, Ove Bohr, who followed in Niels Bohr's footsteps and became the leader of the Niels Bohr Institute after Niels Bohr, also received the Nobel Prize in Physics. My brother, Thomas Bohr, was a physicist, and Finn Åse, who is the director of the Niels Bohr Archive that I work closely with. And my father helped me a lot. He died a few years ago, but he helped me a lot with this presentation. A lot of the pictures comes from a time that he and I spent a summer or maybe 2 summers selecting these old pictures from family history, and a lot of the text that you'll see in Danish written on the slides comes from him. So to start out, I'm not going to talk about the science that Niels Bohr contributed, but here is a page from Wikipedia, and you can see that here it's not maybe very clear, but of course he's well known to have contributed many things to science, the Bohr model notably, and which is now 100 years ago, quantum mechanics aspects, Bohr-Einstein debates, Bohr magneton, Bohr orbital, Bohr radius, and the hafnium, which is one of the principal elements that he discovered. And he got a number of prizes for his work: Nobel Prize, Franklin Medal, Ford Foundation Medal, Order of the Elephant, a very special high order in the Danish system, where you get to hang an elephant around your neck. And you have to, when you go to the Queen or the party, important parties, you have to wear that thing. And when you die, you give it back to the Queen. So his life is outlined here and some of the things that I'll talk about. He was born in 1885. In 1912, he married Margrethe Nørlund, became Bohr. In 1921, after having visited England and working with Rutherford in Cambridge and Manchester, he starts the Niels Bohr Institute, and in 1922 wins the Nobel Prize. At the same year that Einstein got it, I'll return to that. There were debates with Einstein, famous debates in the 20s. In 1932, he moved to a special mansion that was provided by the Carlsberg breweries. I'll tell you more about that. And lived there for 30 years. He was member of many scientific organizations, committees, and notably here, president for the Danish Royal Academy of Sciences for many years. In the war, he spent some years in England and the United States, part of the Manhattan Project, and before that, there was a famous meeting with Heisenberg that I'll return to, displayed in the play called Copenhagen. Heisenberg, the German physicist. In June 1950, he wrote an open letter after the war had ended to the United Nations, where he suggested that we should have open communications in the world, and if we could talk to each other, we might avoid a Cold War. And the politicians didn't really listen to him very much. Unfortunately, I'll tell you more about this, but he might have been right about that. He also was involved instrumentally in many international organizations, and he died in 1962 when I was 12. This is the Niels Bohr Archive. It's a museum, a collection, a research institution directly under the President of the University of Copenhagen. This is Finn Osu, the leader of it, and this is the staff in Felicity and Liz here in this organization. We have a board here, and these are prominent members of Danish science, and I am the family representative and the current chair of this organization. So we spend a lot of time with looking at all these collections and trying to design future projects based on this, and I'll return to that a little more. But it was started by my grandmother in 1962. Its cost is covered by the university, and it houses 6,000 letters and many collective works from Niels Bohr. A lot of other scientists have contributed to this work, and scientists from around the world, and so it's a very large and very interesting and challenging collection to get the most out of. There's a website if you're interested. It also has educational activities, not as professional as this here, but it does have interesting events, seminars, research projects, and next week in Copenhagen we'll have a meeting with our International Advisory Board about future directions. So a year and a half ago in Copenhagen there was a big series of meetings commemorating the 100-year anniversary of the atomic model, which were 3 famous papers written in Nature by Niels Bohr. And there were several conferences in Copenhagen: history of physics, quantum mechanics, state-of-the-art current quantum mechanics, exhibits, and a very interesting specific conference directed around the creativity in science, which I'll discuss a little more. There was a conference about physics and medicine, which a lot of work started in the Bohr Institute, a film festival, there were special coins, and there was an open world conference to follow the ideas of the open world, and there was a book that me and my brother wrote a chapter in, but currently it's only in Danish. I hope it'll get translated by someone. So this was the coin, actually, a beautiful coin. Here's the atomic model, and that's the queen there on the other side. It's made of silver. I bought a lot of them. This is the open letter to the United Nations in 1950, and a lot of people felt it was interesting, and as I'll return to, not all politicians did. But ever since maybe the 60s, 70s, people have organized meetings on the basis of these ideas of openness in the world. And we had one of those conferences, Open World, Niels Bohr, University of Copenhagen, with a lot of very, very interesting speakers. The founder of Wikipedia is here, director of UNESCO, all sorts of people here, and director of Atomic Energy Agency. And so it was a very varied conference with a lot of different input, but actually pretty good discussion. And these conferences are going to continue. Next one's going to be next year in Brazil. So one of the things that we're interested in the Niels Bohr archive for future research is to understand more about how to create an international research center of excellence. Because the Niels Bohr Institute was such an example, and about 32 Nobel laureates were trained there and later became leaders in many countries in physics and received many awards, including many Nobel Prizes. And as I'll try to illustrate, the work was very intense, but also mixed with fun, stimulation, and a lot of good environment. And so we're asking, how can we repeat such a success? Can we use any of the material that's present now for future directed research? How does one create such a center? And other future research areas, and this, what we're looking into is the physics and medicine connection, Scandinavian collaborations, the role of scientists in politics, which I'll return to, and science and humanities, and then not the least, aspects about the husband-wife or spouse relationship in science, which I'm particularly interested in this case I'll return to. So this person here is George von Hevesy. He came from Hungary, and he was a count. He was already had nobility, and he spent a long time at the Niels Bohr Institute, plus at many other institutions. He was co-discoverer of hafnium, a principal element, and he also was the first to, together with Niels Bohr and others, to use radioactive tracers in medicine. And this was at the time quite a significant discovery that, of course, has led to a lot of current work and future plans, and this relates to the areas of how physics in general can be very useful to medicine. So with this, I would like to start on my little bit of background talk here, and this is Christian Bohr, the father of Niels Bohr, and he didn't become very old. He died in 1911, born in 1855, and he had 3 kids. Jenny was the daughter, Niels the son, and Harald the younger son. And they were born in those years. And Christian Bohr himself was a very famous physiologist. He was a physiologist at the University of Copenhagen, and he's known to have discovered aspects about the dead space in the lung and something called the Bohr effect that you have to learn about if you study medicine like I do. Here's a picture of him that hangs over my desk because I think of myself as trying a little bit to follow his footsteps. I've always been very big admirer of him. And this is this Bohr effect that you learn about in medicine. It has to do with that changes in temperature and pH change the circumstances under which hemoglobin binds to oxygen. And so it was, at the time, quite a significant discovery. He was, in fact, nominated for the Nobel Prize a couple of times. And he was appreciated in the field. And this is a paper written 150 years after his birth, so a long time after his death. And this person highlights his importance in physiology, but also says here his example and meetings with friends who visited his house played a major role in the upbringing of his sons, who later became famous scientists. And this is something that I think is fairly widely recognized about Christian Bohr, that he was a great science communicator. He was very broadly interested in many fields of science. This is an old drawing that was given to my grandfather at his 70th birthday in the room in the house of Christian Bohr, that the scientists from many different fields, philosophy, mathematics, physics, they would go to his home after their meetings in the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences, and they'll sit and discuss science, very broadly, very philosophical. And Niels Bohr and Harald Bohr are sitting somewhere here. These little kids, they were allowed in to listen on to these discussions. And according to themselves and many others, this was a great inspiration for their later life in science. And here is Christian Bohr and his wife, Ellen Bohr. Ellen Bohr came from a wealthy financier family or bankier family and in Denmark. Skip one here. Okay, so, and this is another picture here with Niels and Harald and the little Jenny and their mother, Ellen. And then here, they're getting older here, Niels and Harald sitting together with their sister. And we follow them through life here from young, middle-aged to old, and they always stuck together. They really had a very close relationship. And we know that from so many things, including a vast letter writing, lots of letters between them that we still have not completely finished analyzing. They shared a lot of things. They shared a lot of information. Harald was instrumental in helping Niels get back from England when he worked with Rutherford to start up as a professor in Copenhagen, kept him informed about everything. And Niels always consulted with Harald as one of his closest allies. So they had a very tight relationship. And here they are. This picture I don't think has been published before, but you can see they're also making fun of each other. Particularly, Harald made a lot of fun on Niels, and Niels took it very well. And Harald Bohr was a very interesting figure in his own right. This is also from Wikipedia to make it a little more objective. He was a mathematician and a football player, soccer, and he contributed significantly to a number of mathematical theorems, the Bohr-Landau theorem and zeta functions. I know nothing about what this is, but he was a recognized professor of mathematics in Copenhagen, and in addition, he was an eminent soccer player. And this was very unusual for a scientist being a soccer player. And he was actually started out because of inspiration by Christian Bohr, who was a member of this soccer club or football club. And then he started playing, and he made it to the Danish national team. And it's kind of interesting that it was early on in soccer. It's not quite like now, but they played many international matches, and notably at the 1908 Olympics, where Denmark, he was on the team, won silver. And they beat, in this occasion, France 17-1. And this apparently, according to Wikipedia, is still a standing record, even after Germany-Brazil last year in soccer. And in addition to those skills, he was also a wonderful teacher, very inspiring for students. And to this date, there's a prize called the Harald Prize for the most inspiring teacher at the University of Copenhagen. So he had many skills. And here's the picture from them playing soccer. This is Niels, and this is Harald. They are on the soccer team. Now, Niels was not quite as good as Harald. He was a goalie. He never really made it to the national team. And there's a funny story because later in his life, Niels Bohr was invited to visit the king. It was King Christian, who was a fairly conservative king, should we say, or had maybe limited, I shouldn't say anything here on the video other than he was a very respected king. And so he said to Niels Bohr that, Professor Bohr, we are so pleased. The king always says we, he says we. So he said, we are so pleased to hear about your fantastic soccer games. And Niels Bohr, the humble person he was, he says, "Your Majesty, I'm very sorry to have to say this, but it's actually my brother who is the wonderful soccer player, not me." And the king, having been instructed on just to talk about this for the opening part, said again to Niels Bohr, "You're not supposed to counter the king," so he said, "Niels Bohr, Professor Bohr, we are very pleased to hear about your wonderful soccer game." And Niels Bohr again said, "Your Majesty, I apologize, but it's actually my brother Ha who's a big player." And then the king says, "The audience is over, we're done." And it shows the humility of Niels Bohr too. Many people would maybe not have said that. So here is at the 60th birthday, short before Harald died. This is again one of our special pictures from my father here, where you see they having a wonderful time, Harald's wife and Margrethe Bohr. And they were singing songs like you do at parties in Denmark. I wanted to bring in this person, Hannah Ehler, who was in her own right a very unusual and important person for Niels and Harald. Here she talks to Niels and Harald. She was the sister to Niels' mother, and she was a school teacher who started a very novel and very important school in Copenhagen, where for the first time you had girls and boys together. She traveled widely in the world and wrote about education. She was a very strong-willed, very important person who they had very close relationships to. And later in their life, when there were some tragic incidents that happened that I'll discuss, they spent time in Norway skiing, and this was invited by Hannah Ehler, who did a lot of good and had in her school, all the Bohr children went to school there and got a very solid education, and later on many other people went to that school. She was a very outstanding person. There are books, few things written about her, but we're trying to get more together. And this just shows Niels Bohr in a picture that I think is interesting because of his intensity. You can see there is some concentration, and that was one of his great skills, was his ability to really focus on things. And here is, at that time, an application that Niels wrote to when he wanted to travel to England to work with Rutherford in 1911. And this is the full extent of the application to the Carlsberg Foundation. And it says, "I hereby permit myself to apply for 2,500 kroner to spend 1 year at foreign universities." And now you know that when we in science have to apply for anything, the grant is huge, and 25 copies and 36 pages and everything, you know. This was the extent of his application. He got the money, and that was the basis for the ability to do the Bohr model. And it was given by the Carlsberg Foundation, the brewery. And another picture here of him with this intense look that he had, and later in life here, a little more thoughtful. And this picture I like a lot because you see his very pleasant smile. He's smoking the pipe. He smoked the pipe a lot. In fact, he walked around with his hands on the back and a box of matches here, so he could always light the pipe because it would always burn out. He would stuff the pipe and light it and burn it, and people that he was famous for doing that. One day he walked around New York, and somebody said, "Mister, your pocket is burning." And he had forgotten his pipe in the pocket, and it was on flame, and he hadn't seen it. But it was one of his, he really liked that. And so for his 70th birthday, he received a whole truckload of matchboxes. And here he is, and my Uncle Hans and Professor Birgit from Bohr Institute with some of these matches, because he got many more than those. And maybe they saw it as good advertisement, I don't know, but at least they supplied him, not for very long though, because he used so many. And this is a picture from the Bohr Institute, the famous Auditorium A, where a lot of these things happened, and these are some of the famous people here. And this is Oskar Klein, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, and Wolfgang Pauli, and Gamov here, and Landau from Russia. He played in a very important role also in the later connection to Russia, and then Kramers from the Netherlands. And they were having these very interesting and intense discussions, a little more like shown on this picture here, where you see Niels Bohr, O. Bohr, and Stefan Rosenthal, and Ben Modelson here, and a number of other people. And of course, it was a situation where they worked very intensively, had lots of very intensive discussions. They also had fun together. And they did many things to have fun, and they told a lot of jokes. This is too early. And for example, there are many stories, but I like one about Dirac, who they came back from having seen a movie, and it was one of those Wild West movies or whatever it was, and they came back and discussed what they had seen that evening, and Dirac said, well, I found it totally unbelievable, but very amazing that the princess just was standing on that edge of the rock, and she was just falling off the rock, and it was just amazing. And then, but what was even more amazing to me was that just at the time that she was falling over the rock, this prince came along on a white horse, and he came early enough to just grab her hand and lift her up. And then he said, but what was most amazing, unbelievable, was that there happened to be a film crew filming it right there at the time. So Niels Bohr became quite famous in Denmark, and there was many jokes and fun satiric drawings about him. This is one actually from his trip to the United States. And here this man introduces him and says, and our famous guest will now repeat his famous lecture about chain reactions. And this is also one of the drawings here. Niels Bohr became part of a famous in Denmark, a real man of Denmark. Here you see Niels Bohr. He has the order of the elephant. So he's riding on an elephant. And he is famous, and he is very good to squash up atoms into small pieces. He is the most clever man in Denmark. We don't have so many of those in Denmark, and therefore we like to show them off for the tourists. And then the tourists will think that we all are that clever. He's an honorary doctor, and that's much better than the regular doctor who comes and looks into your throat and gives your mother a sleeping pill or something, a pacifier. And this was his seal when he got to be a nobleman, and this is the symbol of yin and yang, which was very prominent in his thinking of these contraries that meet. And that is reflected in many things, and I had picked some more things, but I'll just mention one that he always liked to talk about, is that there is the shallow and the deep truth. And the shallow truth is something very simplistic, that the color there is brown. But the deep truth is one about where you can say that the opposite is also true. And that's where the opposites meet. So if you say life is good, it's true. But if you say life is bad, it's also true. So he spoke a lot about that and many other aspects of this kind of philosophy here. And so just a point of returning to the theme about what made him such a great leader of the Niels Bohr Institute, I've just picked a couple of personality traits and that's only something that I've come up with here. He was a very brilliant physicist. You need that. You need somebody really outstanding in the field to lead a center of excellence and creativity. He was very open. He was very willing to listen to all sorts of other ideas. That didn't mean that he went along with them, but he really created an atmosphere where he was happy to be opposed and to have great discussions, think a lot about them, and then reach maybe a common truth or something. And he was open to many things in life. He was a very humble person, and I've given some reflection of this, and I'll maybe get back to that later and talk about his humility. He really was. He really didn't think that he was the world's leading scientist. He really felt that other people had done so much and he had only contributed a minimal amount. And he had a great sense of humor, very important in this. He was very resourceful. He had this ability to concentrate tremendously on whatever he did. If he was physics, then it was total concentration. If it was playing with kids, it was total concentration on that. And it was physical and mental. And physical, he had a lot of physical strength. As a kid, he hit a lot of the other kids in school and won many fights and stuff that's not very widely known about him, but he was actually could be a bully sometimes. And so this is a picture of him and his wife that it belongs to me and that my father had, and I like that picture, and it shows at the late stages in their life, and Margrethe Bohr, who I'll talk about. So Niels and Margrethe worked very closely together, and I'll spend a little time talking about her. It's one of my favorite themes. They were a super team. They had a lot of mutual respect, trust, and love, and Margrethe was actually engaged in everything. And we know that in the early letter writing, she was informed about all the early discoveries about atoms before anyone else was, and she had deep understanding and insight and was his soulmate, and we know that they always consulted with each other on many occasions. Here, my Uncle Ernest here, and they were talking together here on this picture about all sorts of things in daily and more long-term decisions. And here they're sitting on their favorite sofa with a picture of Christian. That was the oldest son, and he died only 18 years old in 1934, very unfortunately, on a sailing expedition where my grandfather was present on. And they couldn't possibly save him. It was a big sorrow for them, of course. And it's also shown in this stamp here that came out showing that they were a team. There's a lot of very interesting correspondence between Niels and Margrethe Bohr. Firstly, from the time he was in England, as I said, he shared all sorts of things with her. Long letters go back and forth. He told her about his discoveries. He told her about his relations with Rutherford and others way before he shared it with other people. So they had a very close relationship, and she, in turn, also wrote him long, very beautiful letters. And some of this is well known, but one aspect that's come out recently about Niels Bohr was that he was very lyric. He appreciated literature a lot. He read a lot of literature. He liked many of the Norwegians or the German poets. And he wrote some letters to Margrethe Bohr in those years when they were just engaged that were very lyric. And this letter says, and then we fly out over the big ocean, but we're not flying the shortest way because it's Christmas Eve, and we're flying further to the north where Christmas belongs. Look, see that house full of lights in the snow. See the beautiful fir trees that are covered with snow and that look like such amazing figures. And see the stars that are shining and glittering in the frosty night, and the moon that's shining its light over all these and illuminating it more than the brightest sunlight. Look, see, this has never been seen by a human who hasn't been so far up north. Let us take a look into that big house. Look at the large hall there. Look at the large fireplace, the enormous Christmas tree, and all the happy people. Look, see that little boy and his aunt and his cousin. That little boy has almost grown up and is talking to that old gentleman, and on and on. And it was very interesting, and there's a book that came out last year by also John Heilbrunn that discusses and shows some of these new findings, because these letters were not released from the family possession until very recently, and there still are more to come that illustrates this whole side of Niels and Margrethe Bohr. So Margrethe was born in 1890 in this house in southern Denmark. Her father was a pharmacist, and he had a private-owned pharmacy. They had a nice house with a beautiful garden behind, and here she is, 7 years old. And here she is just at the time that they got engaged, which was in 1910, and you see her very attractive. And they met in an interesting way, because down in this beautiful garden that they had with all these trees in the southern town of Slagelse, she had two brothers, Paul and Niels Erik, and they studied at the University of Copenhagen. Paul became a director of the National Museum, actually, and Niels Erik of the institute that makes maps. But they were the two that met Niels, invited him to come down there, and he met her there in the garden. They got engaged, and this picture is pretty widely known, I guess. And here is a picture that's not published, showing a charming picture that Niels had of her, and from about 1940. And they had 5 sons, which was in itself pretty unique. They actually, and here you see they were Christian, the oldest one. They were Hans Erik, Owen, Ernest. And here's the happy father with the little kids. And then, as I had mentioned before, in 1932, they moved to this beautiful mansion. And the way that happened was that the brewer of Carlsberg Brewery, his name was Jacobsen, he had developed this large brewery. He had developed a lot of new techniques and imported new techniques for beer making from around the world. He was pretty considered a leading beer maker. And fortunately for some, he didn't get along with his son, and so he decided to give all his money to the Danish National Academy of Sciences, which still to the day today owns the Carlsberg breweries. And it's an interesting relationship that has turned out to be successful for Carlsberg breweries. And of course, the scientists are stimulated to drink the product, which we don't mind. And so he gave his private home also to the National Academy of Sciences to select a scientist to live there, and they chose Niels Bohr, and he moved into this wonderful mansion. And when I was a child, we could run around and play there, and it had a large garden, it had marble steps, it had a beautiful dining room here with a statue of Helena, and this candelabra here, and we as kids could sit up there under the ceiling and watch what was going on, and we sometimes were invited also to sit in on the table. And because of his stature at the time, because of this home, it became a place where also the Danish foreign ministry used him to help invite people there and talk to many politicians, and that helped them, and they also gave him contact to a lot of important people in politics, as I return to. And they had this beautiful room here. We called it Pompeii. It was styled after the Pompeii ruins and close to Rome, and there was a large room. They could have large parties, 100 people, and it would be scientists or family or dignitaries, and my grandmother was a wonderful host, taking care of everything you can see here. And she was also very interested in the garden, a large garden, but there were gardeners to help with this. And as kids, we could play hide and seek there. It was really fun. And they then went to many events, and here they are to go to the royal court for dinner here, and he's wearing his different things, including the Order of the Elephant and other things that he received. And then they got to meet many people. Here is a picture of Heisenberg, which we'll return to. This is Ben Gurion, the first president of Israel. They became very good friends, actually, and he visited Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion visited Carlsberg. Here's the King of Denmark, and here's Louis Armstrong. So it was a very different kind of clientele that they got together with here. And here is Eisenhower when he received the Ford Foundation Atoms for Peace Prize. And this was a very special event for me the visit of the English Queen, which at the time, and maybe still, is the finest of royalty. And she came to the house where we lived there, where my grandfather lived in 1957. Queen Elizabeth, the still reigning Queen Elizabeth. And here's Queen Elizabeth, and here's the Danish Queen Ingrid, and the Danish King Frederik, Margrethe Bohr, the president of Carlsberg Breweries, and Prince Philip, and Niels Bohr. And you don't see a lot of security, by the way. At those days, we didn't have a lot of security. And here I am watching this. Me and some of my cousins, we were watching this event, and my aunt and my uncle and Professor Børge Jessen, a well-known mathematician. And I was selected to give her some flowers, the Queen. And it might have taken a minute, maybe two, but it was a great honor, of course. But I don't remember the flowers so much as I remember another aspect of the event, which was that if you just have dignitaries or Danish royalty, then you clean the toilets carefully. But if it's the Queen of England, you have to replace the lid of the toilet with a brand new one. And so, as kids, we were standing there and wondering if she would use this brand new toilet or not. And I have to say that I don't think she did. There was also Nehru from India. They visited Carlsberg, and President Nehru, and they visited him later on in a trip to India and Calcutta and Delhi. And this is a family picture with the different uncles here, and this is my mother and my father and Hans and Eric's wife and all the little kids here, and this is me at his 70th birthday in 1955. That birthday was a very wonderful event, and the radio had a special radio show during the dinner with a lot of people from around the world talking to him, and he and the Prime Minister and a lot of people. And at the end of this event, he got up and he thanked all the other people, spent all his time on thanking many of the people I mentioned here for their wonderful contribution. Again, it was a very humble approach. And he plays with the kids, and you could see that he's a great footballer here, right? And I'm standing here juggling the ball with my cousin here, and what I was trying to say before was that he put great intensity into playing with the kids. So you really felt that he was interested in you, at least during the time that he played with you, which is not always the case for fathers, I would say. But so he managed to, with little time, to give you a lot of intensity and interest and concentration. It was a wonderful thing. And here he is feeding my sister and teaching her how to eat food here. So he took a great deal of interest also in upbringing of kids. My father got the doctorate here in 1954, and you can see how happy they are. And then he followed in his footsteps, did. And here they are working here together on some formulas. And my brother Thomas, who later became a physicist and who is a physicist, he got training at that time doing his own formulas down here. So he had to go into the family business. And here is again a picture of him and his children, and him and his grandchild, me. We're skiing in Norway. And again, he was very attentive to teaching me how to ski when he could have done more interesting things. And I still appreciate that. I love skiing. And it's a picture of me here in the early 50s, and him and my father, also a very nice picture, of course, never published anywhere. So he got the Nobel Prize in 22. He made some money from that, and then he decided to buy this house in northern Zealand. Just now it's less than an hour's drive. Then it was longer from Copenhagen. They had a beautiful place, and this place was a summer house. They moved up there in the summer, and many physicists came with them and stayed for shorter, longer periods where they worked with him. And so he would spend a large part of a day. Well, this was also a very artistic area of Denmark with many artists living next door, and the next door neighbor was a painter, William Scharf, who painted the house, and many other nice paintings from the whole area and the forest there. And here he is walking back and forth. He was always spending time working in this little house here that now belongs to me and my brother, where a lot of physicists would sit and help him write his papers, and they still remember that place. And he was also playful. He was driving the motorcycle. It was Gammov's motorcycle. And this is Max Delbrück here. Delbrück, of course, became a very famous biologist and led many things and went to Caltech. And he said later that he was very much inspired to be a biologist by Niels Bohr. And here's Niels Bohr and Margrethe driving this motorcycle, Gammov's motorcycle. They very much enjoyed these tea parties, and people would come over in the afternoon for a wonderful tea, which was full of cake and cookies. And so we, of course, attended this as much as we could and met very many interesting people on this occasion. It was a good way to socialize because you don't maybe if you have people for dinner, it's a long event sometimes, and here you could have people for a few hours and still get a lot out of it. And they enjoyed that very much, as you can see here. And this is just a family event, Margrethe's 70th birthday, beautiful decoration, all Italian style, because at that time they really loved Italy. They traveled a lot in Italy. And it was a surprise party for her. You can see she's brought into the party here. And look at the excitement here, and the brothers were all excited, and we kids were watching as she saw this happening. And many of the pictures that I'm showing here today was collected for that event. Here she is sitting next to her oldest son, Hans, and to her brother, Niels Erik, at this particular event. Very festive in that hall that I mentioned before. And here's Ben Modelson and Rosenfeld, Leon Rosenfeld, that some people may know in the field of physics. And she also came along to my father's Nobel Prize in 1925 and attended the whole event there. So she and did a wonderful job. I had a special opportunity to escort her to Greenland in 1982. It was the 1,000th anniversary of Greenland's founding. And we went up there, and the ministry, Greenland ministry, would like to have a family member escort her, and they really wanted a doctor to come along because she was a little old at that time. She was 90 years old, and so they asked me to come along, and I certainly enjoyed it. We saw a lot of interesting things in Greenland, also from her brother's explorations. And there was a funny newspaper clip. It was very positive to experience Margrethe Bohr, who, even though she was 92 years old, were participating in all the dinners. It was a big event, 1,000th anniversary. Many important people were there. And her grandson, the doctor and scientist Vilhelm Bohr, came along, also invited to participate. And during the lunches, the young scientist was very good at getting her all sorts of delicatesses, food from the table, but she was worried that he would be forgetful, and so she shouted to him, remember the schnapps, you know, the liquor. So I have a little clip from a movie that has not been out. We found it in the archive here, and it gives a little picture of her, and I would like to show a little of it if it works here. And it was recorded by Gloria Davenport, remembering Niels Bohr, and it's just to give an example of her, and in this case, the discussion of her trip in 1937 when she's here, 90 years old, 92 years old.
Ever since 1920. And they stayed for a long time. There var Sigurd, og der var Kimor, og der var først der var Nyshnand, Takamini, Hore, there were many. And then they invited us to come to Japan together with us, to bring a son, because it had been so much in our family that they knew our children so well.
Yeah. It's Professor Victor Weisskopf from MIT.
The journey was planned for 1934.
Erik Bohr.
And then the tragedy happened, that Christian drowned. And then, of course, we gave it up.
And Bohr.
And then we saw forward to do it another time. Then it came off 2 years later. And then Hans was then our eldest son came with us. Yeah. And we started in January, and we went across to England, and then we went from further with a big boat across the Atlantic Sea to America. And a very stormy weather, I remember, terribly stormy. Yeah. And then we stayed for months in Princeton and Baltimore and those places there. And then we went to the western part and stayed in Berkeley and Pasadena. Another month. And then we sailed from San Francisco. We stayed mostly in Berkeley, really. And then we were just on a visit to Millikan down in Pasadena, I remember. Yeah. And then we sailed across to Japan, landed on the way on Hawaii. And we spent one day, the boat stopped one day in Hawaii. And we were so let's that we took a taxi of our own instead of taking the dinner that was sent out because it was from the boat. We thought we would rather go by ourselves and see what the chauffeur could show us. And we were looking at pineapple fields and at sugar cane fields and in surf riding. And then suddenly the driver came and said, "Now the boat is going in 20 minutes. Oh, we got a shock. And we rushed through Hawaii Street. And when we came down to the bottom, the guard was there, and he said, "Oh, the boat is going." And I rushed up, and Niels, as his goodness, stopped to collect all the sugar canes and so we had collected, you know. And I remember the man shouted after him, "You're the foolish old gentleman I ever saw." And I rushed over up to the landing, and there they had taken the off already. And then there came a man out, and I went in, and I waved them, and then he put it out again. Then I went out on this landing and stood in the middle of it till Niels had come. They couldn't put me down in the sea. And then he came, but we were really shaking. Yes. Because short after our arrival, first everything was arranged, no date, and the Emperor's tea party was 2 or 3 days after. And it would have been a scandal if we just had been careless. So we landed also in Yokohama, and all by our friends and by Danish government authorities down there, consulate and so on, embassy, and we were stayed then in Tokyo for 1 month. And Niels gave, I think he gave 8 lectures. But then we went to the Emperor's tea party, and he had other talks with the Emperor. Was interested in science. And
was it the same Emperor?
Yeah, they were very nice. The Emperor and the Empress. Yeah, I remember. And I remember when first we came, was sitting in the hotel, and our ambassador came, and we were sitting and talking with the Japanese friends, Nishina, and others. They said, "I've never seen Japanese people so gay and free." I said, "No, we know each other so well." And now so we spent looking around. Of course, there was very interesting places, and Hans was very useful in writing down on the blackboard, and also Nishina before the lectures and so on. And Hans kept a diary, and that was wonderful. And we were taken to see all nice places in what's the mountain?
Kamakura.
No, Kamakura. And the old town.
Kyoto and Nara.
Many, Nara and all the mobile. What's the mountain?
Fujiyama.
Fujiyama was a wonderful impression also.
How was it to be a woman in Japan? Did you see
it was
the
nice,
wives?
And they were so nice to me, and it was a little embarrassing for the Japanese wives because they were used to go after their husband. And now when I was there, they should go first. And they were a little embarrassed, I had to push them in first. According to European customs,
So you helped to promote the women's cause in Japan?
But in any case, And what was good, then when we were going, had been a month in Tokyo, we were going to travel a little around in the country. And then the president of the university, Dr. Nagoya, who was a physiologist, I think, and doing the same as Donna. And he came to the hotel and said, I'm coming to see you and to say goodbye to you, and to tell you that I've been to all your husband's 8 lectures.
Yeah.
And I've never before seen that in a series of 8 lectures, all lectures have been at the same high standard. Used to be the first and the second perhaps, and then slowing down. But this time it has been all been at the same high standard. And this has been a good lesson for Japanese students and scholars, he said.
It seems he got up early in the morning to prepare the lecture, very early in the morning at the Imperial Hotel.
Yeah.
And I remember he told that once
yes,
there was a fountain with goldfish.
Yeah.
He saw the people taking out the goldfish and polishing them.
Ah, no.
This is a picture from that trip in 1937 where they went around the world and from. So a little bit about some relations that he had. This is Einstein, an old picture where they're sitting together at Princeton, and here's a later picture with Bohr, Frank, and Einstein and Rabi. Rabi was in New York, and there's a lot of discussion about the debates they had and who was right and so forth. And this is, as I understand it, clearly an ongoing thing, but they did have a very warm relationship, and I just found these 2 letters here that I thought would be interesting to just highlight. So they received, as I mentioned, the Nobel Prize the same year in 1922, and that was because Einstein's Nobel Prize was delayed because of the war, First World War. And so Niels Bohr was writing to Einstein how deeply honored he is to get the Nobel Prize. At the same time, I'm sending my warmest congratulations on the occasions of you receiving the Nobel Prize. You have received so many recognitions, and this may not be of great importance to you, but it also brings such useful monetary award. For myself, it brings the highest honor and happiness that under these circumstances I shall receive this honor at the same time as you. I know how little I have deserved this compared to your enormous contribution. And there's a handwritten letter from Einstein here to Bohr from the ship here in the way back from Japan. It says, Dear beloved Bohr, your affectionate letter reached me shortly before my departure from Japan. I can say without exaggeration that it pleased me as much as the Nobel Prize. I find your fear of possibly getting the prize before me especially endearing. That is generally Bohr-like. Your new analysis on the atom accompanied me on my journey, and my love for your mind has grown even more. I now believe I finally understand the connection between electricity and gravitation. Eddington came closer to the gist of it than Way. This is a splendid voyage. He was traveling back from Japan. I'm delighted by Japan, the Japanese. I'm sure that you would be too. This was before Niels Bohr went on this trip we just saw. Traveling by sea is a splendid experience, and the caressing warmth near the equator, warm water drips down and so forth. Warm regards to a happy reunion in Stockholm from Einstein. So I think it's about the last major topic I wanted to bring up is these events that many people have been interested in this play in Copenhagen, because this play came out some years ago, written by Michael Frayn, and it highlights some very interesting things about science and the war and the importance of scientists. And in this play, there are 3 people. There's Margrethe and Niels Bohr, and then there's Heisenberg. And what it highlights is that the scientists at that time were really important in the events that took place and were, I feel, listened to more than they are today at the high level of political decision, and that this is something that a lot of physicists are interested in because it's a very intense dialogue between these 3 people, and there's the question of what really happened. What took place was that Heisenberg was trained in Copenhagen in the 20s and became a very close friend of the Bohr family, and particularly and the children, everything. They called him Uncle Werner. They were a very close relation, like Niels Bohr had with many of his students. And then at the time of the war, many German scientists decided to leave Germany. And Lise Meitner, for example, was one of them. She went to Copenhagen, and Niels Bohr spent a lot of his time helping German scientists to escape Germany before the war came in 1940, is when Germany invaded Denmark. And so Heisenberg stayed in Germany and traveled to Copenhagen in 1941 December. And this was the worst time of the war for Europe, because at that time Hitler had almost conquered France, had conquered much of Europe, had conquered Dunkirk, and was standing close to invading Britain, who, of course, stood up to this, and it was before he had decided to go into Russia, and maybe that was the mistake, one of the mistakes he made. So at that point, Heisenberg traveled to Copenhagen, and there was a great deal of dislike of the Germans in Copenhagen at the time. He was a famous scientist and considered one of the best mathematicians in physics, at least in those years, and I think much later. And he comes to Copenhagen to give a lecture, and nobody showed up. He came together with some German officials, and then he asked to see Niels Bohr, and they had this debate which has to do about whether Niels Bohr knew anything about the developing of the atomic bomb, about whether he could maybe help Germany, because Germany was, of course, going to win the war, and a lot of uncertainty about what Heisenberg really did. Was he then later trying to help the Germans, or was he actually sabotaging the Germans? And in this play, it comes out in a very interesting way, because you can really see it both ways. In some ways, he looked like he was supporting Germany, and in other ways, with these calculations of plutonium, it could be argued that he was trying to hamper the whole German effort. And so, in the play, Margrethe Bohr is very actively sort of talking about very negative to Heisenberg and Germany, and Niels Bohr is more measured. We know a lot about this history. My father was present for some of this, and so one of the things that's been discussed in the play is, why was Niels Bohr not really so outspoken, and what did he really think about Heisenberg and so forth? And so a few years ago, here is Bohr and Heisenberg at the Niels Bohr Institute some years earlier, and by the way, drinking Carlsberg beer, of course. And now you know why. And so this is an interesting letter that we found many years later that Niels Bohr wrote to Heisenberg, but never sent. In this letter, which was posted at the Niels Bohr archive at one point, and still are only partially shown, Niels Bohr actually shows some anger at what happened and his feelings about Heisenberg coming to Copenhagen in such a manner, and then he nevertheless never sent it, and this was just shortly before his death. So it was clear that he, at one point, of course, had a very close relation to Heisenberg. When it came to this issue with the whole war effort, he was very, of course, strongly against this and any association with Germany, and of course, a few years later, he had to flee from Denmark, partly Jewish, but partly because the Germans made it clear that they were going to use him to develop physics there if he didn't get out. So he escaped to Sweden under very dramatic conditions. The whole family was split up and sailed over to Sweden in October 43, which was a famous event in Danish history, where private people came out in the middle of the night with their boats and sailed. A lot of people, mainly of Jewish descent, thousands of Jews were saved. Their lives were saved by being shipped over under pretty dangerous conditions between Denmark and Sweden, because the German boats were patrolling the whole area. And all the children also had to escape this way, and Margrethe and Niels. And then from there he went on to England in another dramatic event where he was transported in a small Mosquito aircraft, and at one point the pilot turns around and Niels Bohr has fainted, And because he lost the oxygen mask that was sitting around his face was pretty big, I guess, and he lost the mask, and he fainted. And the pilot made a deep dive very quickly and kind of saved his life. And then from there on, he went on to work with the Manhattan Project. In Sweden, on the way, he did a lot to help the Jewish. He talked to the Swedish authorities, helped the best he could with that. So this is somewhat what I also mentioned here, that he went to Sweden and England, and during the time of the Manhattan Project, Niels Bohr had a nickname, had another name because of Secret Service. He spent a lot of time politicking right after the war, and he and Einstein and others worked on the politicians. And the interesting thing was that Roosevelt understood the ideas about the open world and was very much in favor, but Churchill was not in favor. And there are some interesting stories about the meetings with Churchill, who didn't understand Niels Bohr and who thought he was strange, and who, because he had friends in Russia, actually at one point trying to arrest him. And Churchill was not open to this open world idea, was not open to involving the Russians in anything, but Roosevelt was, and Roosevelt had promised Niels Bohr to convince Churchill at some meeting right towards the end of the war, and then Roosevelt died at that point. So that was sort of, he made a big effort talking to these and many other people. So with this, I'll just say that there's a lot of interesting literature, and I like Pice's book, Niels Bohr and His Times, is a very interesting book. Richard Rhodes' book, The Making of the Atom Bomb, is now an older book, but still very worthwhile if you want to read about the war efforts and many of the people in the war, and Oppenheimer and so forth. This recent book, Finn Osel and John Heilbrunn, is a very interesting thing about the lyric thing. Our book is in Danish there, and then you can also choose to read Niels Bohr's collected works, which are you can get is 12 volumes with all the things, many things in there that might be of interest. So with that, I will thank you for your attention. Hope that it's been of some interest, and be glad to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much. So we'll open the floor to questions now. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can make your way to the side here. The mic is lit, and we have our first person right here. So please, in studio, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this lecture that showed the human side of a great scientist. I was wondering if we have any account of how the atomic model was discovered.
Yeah, as I said, I'm not a physicist, and I can't. I could maybe a little bit, but I don't want to spend time trying to discuss the physics. But of course, he went to Rutherford's laboratory in Manchester, and he went on there, and he worked with Rutherford's basic model, and then he developed the new structure of the atom with the electrons around the atom, and he developed the whole atomic model idea based on Ernest Rutherford's initial discoveries when he came there. And then, yeah. Sorry. Thank you.
Very good. Second in-studio question.
Well, I have 3 boys that are very much interested in science, so I'm kind of interested to hear what kind of, how should I put it, homework ethics, so to speak, was part of the Bohr family. Did your parents push you to do a lot of homework, or was it a free spirit type of atmosphere?
Remarkably little pushing. Maybe they should have pushed more because we were not pushed. But I think one of the things that, no, there was no, I mean, of course, they encouraged work in the school, but it was not a pushing thing, and it was certainly not a pushing thing towards any career development either. But one thing that my grandfather always did was he liked to give us some sort of call it mixture of jokes and questions where you would try to use your brain to figure a problem out, but it would be a fairly simple problem, but always a little challenge that you had to do a calculation or think about something. So in that sense, he encouraged just, shall we say, the use of the brain, but I never heard him ask how it went in school or how the grades were or complain over that or anything like that. So it was a subtle encouragement, I would say, of that. So, and also later on, and my father. I don't know if that's much help, though.
That's wonderful. Here, we'll go to the online audience. There's a question, and this is sort of in that theme. What were Niels Bohr's philosophical inspirations? If you were to encapsulate that.
Philosophical inspirations. He was very impressed with, as I mentioned, literature and Chinese philosophy, Japanese philosophy. That was one part of why I illustrated this trip around the world, and I didn't have time to show more. They also went to China. We're very impressed with that, and that's where the yin and yang comes from. So he was interested in philosophy as such, but then he also, by the way, one of the people that sat around the table in Christian Bohr's home was a philosopher, Høffding, who later actually was a prominent philosopher in Denmark and later lived in that house for a while, but he was also an inspiration. So from early on, the subject of philosophy was important to him.
Good, thank you. Let's take one last question from in studio.
What was the jitterbug reference in the slide show of him getting the Nobel Prize at the top of the slide?
Sorry, I don't remember what that was. The slide of him getting the Nobel Prize. Oh, jitterbug dancing, I think. That was what it was. So there was some dancing and a lot of family with the dancing in Sweden. So it was a very formal affair, most of it. But then after that, there were some fun pictures with my father dancing with my sister and others dancing. I don't remember if Margrethe Bohr danced at that occasion. I think that's what jitterbug is.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
A star is sort of as a CD in a tent. The structure,
To the microphone. Yes.
It isn't just spheres, and Mr. Bohr, as he developed his model of the atom, there's a SPDF structure. In a star, the Kuiper belt is sort of a disk. It isn't like a ball. The oort is a wider area. Was he interested in space at all? Was his concept of the solar system as developed as the atom?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, he surely must have been, but it was not so much space that I remember that he tried to inspire people to go in. I showed a picture of Delbruck that was there. At the time, at one stage, he became very interested in biology and encouraged some of his students at that time to enter biology. That was before the war in those years. So that was one of the things that he got very interested in early on. I'm sure he was interested in space. I can't recollect very much about that, sorry.
Quite.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Vilhelm Bohr, thank you very much.